All right. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn for CASA's information about guardianship subsidies and adoption subsidies. We have Eileen Runty, who is leading us from DCFS, along with Carrie Newman, Sarah Meyer, Heather Chizzo, and Joseph Anthony. I appreciate your time so very much that you're spending with us. This will help lots of people in the northern region. So Eileen, I turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. I have done some presentations and trainings for CASA before. I think most recently was DuPage County last year this time. So if you're coming back from DuPage, welcome back and welcome to everyone who's new to us and to this training. So Carrie and I both cover all of our northern region, as we are both supervisors for this entire region of all the subsidy staff, um, pre-subsidy, post-subsidy, and while subsidies are being written. So we do cover 17 counties. I had shared, or Carrie had shared our agenda with you. So just so you know, we do cover 17 counties, including Lake, McHenry, Kane, DuPage, Will, Grundy, Kankakee, Kendall, Lee, Ogle, Boone, Winnebago, Joe Davies, DeKalb, Carroll, Stevenson, and Whiteside. So those are all the counties that we cover. Um, we have a shared team of 10 staff that both write subsidies for our DCFS cases, as well as review all the subsidies for private agency cases. And then we also have 3 post guardianship and adoption staff that manage caseloads once the guardianship or adoption goes through. So we have here, there's a lot of people on, so I definitely see Heather. Heather is one of our DCFS subsidy writers. So if you have a case that you are a CASA on and you know it's a DCFS case, not with a private agency, Heather, or Joseph also if he's on, I don't see him here, but he might be in the background somewhere there. Um, Joseph is out of our Elgin office, and Heather is out of the Aurora office, and both of those two write the subsidies for our DCFS cases. So we also have Shaquila Williams, and then we have an open position that we are hoping will get filled very, very quickly here in Elgin as well. So they cover all the region. We like to kind of assign cases. By like geographical location. So, like Joseph predominantly covers McHenry and Lake County, and Heather covers more Kane, DuPage, Kendall, and then there's some overlap as well. So we just kind of, depending upon what caseloads are, that's kind of how Carrie and I decide who we're going to be assigning cases when cases are referred right to us. So, um, there is that in terms of our coverage. Um, I have 2 DCFS subsidy reviewers who review all of the private agency cases. Um, Whatever agency, if the agency is located here in Northern Region under one of those counties that I just reviewed. I have Scott James and Mike Anton. You may have heard those 2 names before. And they cover the entire region of private agency cases, which is actually the bulk of where most of the work comes from. The DCFS cases are a much smaller population than those private agency cases that we have. So, any questions about that? If you have a question, and there's so many people here, and I may not see if you raise your hand, so I'm going to actually ask if Sharie could kind of help Carrie and I to check the chat. So if you have a question and you want to put it in the chat, and then maybe Sharie can kind of keep her eye on that and then alert us if there's a question so that we can be sure we're answering any specific questions.
That's a good plan.
Perfect. Okay, great. Um, I don't really want to get into specifics about particular cases because we could probably go on for hours and hours, depending upon your experience. But we'll just kind of share the general information. And then if you have questions, about the general information, you can let us know. If you have specific questions about specific cases, you could email us after this meeting and we will do our best to go ahead and follow up and get answers back to you. So, sound good? Okay. So how do cases come to our unit? Um, we are one, if it's a DCFS case and the worker has sent that case to legal screening and the goal has been changed to substitute care pending termination, and then eventually that case goes to court and the parents' rights are terminated. It is at that point that the DCFS worker would refer the case to Carrie and myself for assignment to a subsidy writer. So the very first thing that they would do is to send us a full packet of information. Then Carrie and I would look at that and review it and determine who would be best to, be assigned to serve that case and to go ahead and start writing those subsidies. Once the case is referred to us, and we review it and determine that it is indeed a full packet of all the information that we need, our timeline starts kind of ticking at that point. And it is our goal ultimately to have the subsidy done within 90 days of that referral. So that's kind of what we target. Now I want to talk about some of the barriers that we see with those referrals. Sometimes we can get referrals where it's not a complete packet. Most specifically, one of the biggest issues that we have seen is background checks. Cases getting referred to us where we don't have a full background check. And we have to have that to be able to move forward. Workers, depending upon their level of experience, may not know that they don't have a full background, that family hasn't been fingerprinted. So we are doing our best to educate everyone that is really to be done. And actually the requirement is that is to be done within 60 days of the child being placed there. So if it's a relative home, of course, if it's a licensed home, they should have all their backgrounds and that's not an issue. But if it is a relative that is a new placement, the requirement is that home be fingerprinted within 60 days because we need to know like exactly all the history and information on this person, who this child is placed with, and how can we make a determination that this is a good permanent resource for this child if we don't have all the information and all the background. We have had cases where fingerprints were not done for 2+ years, and then they find, an aggravated kidnapping conviction. Our region is such that we border both Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana. So we certainly can have, cases where we might see that the parent is clear here in Illinois, but they may not be in other states. So that's really why that fingerprinting is so important from the very beginning. Carrie, do you want to add anything about that?
No, but I did see somebody put a question just regarding like explaining what the subsidy actually is. So I don't know if you
Okay.
want me to go into that.
Yes, we will definitely get there. So that's how DCFS cases come to us. Ultimately, that's kind of our assignment procedure. We look at getting that case, and once that case comes to us, like I said, our target is a 90-day time frame to have that completely done. there are several pieces that go into that, and we'll kind of talk about that more specifically here shortly. So I talked a little bit about Scott and Mike who do the private agency cases, and I saw some chats going on to kind of talk about what some of the agencies in this region are, like, Allendale, LCFS, LSSI, YSB. There are several. There's actually 16 different agencies that we work with. Well, locations anyways, like LCFS in particular has 4 different sites in this region, but there are a total of 16 different sites that both Mike and Scott go to and get packets from, receive packets from. So, that is that. So the subsidy is actually, I see a question here in the chat. What if TPR is in the appeal process? And I didn't get the second part of that question.
So does the appeal need to be completed before the subsidy can be done?
Okay, great question. And the answer is no, it does not. However, that appeal does need to be resolved prior to the finalization of the adoption. So we can accept cases here where there's an appeal pending, and then we're not going to sign the consents for adoption until we know that appeal has been resolved. That is also part of the panel attorney's job and role, is to make sure before they go to file that adoption petition that there is not an appeal pending somewhere. Okay. So the subsidy, what the subsidy is the agreement itself. It's the agreement between the department and that family for that child in particular. The actual subsidy document itself is a 19-page form. It could certainly entail many more pages. If you have a child who has like pretty extensive medical, you might be adding pages to that. But that subsidy is the actual agreement between the department and the family. There are several things that can be included with the subsidy, and there are certainly things that cannot be included with the subsidy. Some of the very standard basic things that are covered are a non-recurring fee, which basically means like the fees that we pay towards the adoption attorney. We will pay the attorney the fee to finalize this adoption. That includes fully reviewing that subsidy with the family. They are able to receive $2,250 per adoption. We have a list of panel attorneys that have been trained by the department to review those subsidies. They're very familiar. Most of the attorneys on our panel list are very familiar with the process. So they can work through those pretty quickly. The family can also elect to choose an attorney that is not on the panel list. And if they do that, they are required to pay out of pocket for that $2,250, and then we will reimburse them after the adoption is finalized. So if they select someone who's on the panel attorney, they don't have to ever worry about any of that money for the attorney. We pay that directly to the attorney once the adoption is finalized. If they choose someone who's not on the panel, they need to pay it up front, and then we will reimburse them after the fact. So that's pretty standard for both adoptions and guardianships, the attorney fees. The second piece is the medical coverage. If they are a youth in care, they are receiving the youth care medical coverage through the department. They are allowed to continue that beyond the adoption or guardianship. They also have an opportunity to pick another managed care program, or they can elect to put that child on their own insurance. If they put that child on their own insurance, they're still going to have Medicaid as a backup. So it's ultimately up to them to decide how they want that to go and what they want the coverage to be. However, they are entitled to those medical benefits. Okay. And then the third standard coverage in the subsidy is the actual subsidy amount. So as a foster parent, they are getting a monthly board payment for that child in their care, right? That is going to continue after the adoption or guardianship. The amount will remain the same as it was prior to the adoption or guardianship. If it's an unlicensed home and they're not getting that license rate, they're just getting what we call the standard of need rate because they are not a licensed home. Once the adoption or guardianship gets finalized, they are going to then get that license rate. So that rate would go up for unlicensed homes. Any questions about any of that? Is the Medicaid insurance in jeopardy due to recent congressional votes? Not to my knowledge, it is not. Any other questions about? So those are some of the basics. One of the biggest things that is not covered after the adoption or guardianship is daycare. So we do not pay daycare as part of the subsidy agreement unless the child is younger than the age of 3. So that is a big sticking point for a lot of families, especially if you have a big SIB group, that we do not pay daycare over the age of 3. I saw a question, can therapy get covered? Yes, absolutely. Therapy can get covered. Like before, most agencies and DCFS, they have contracts with providers that will pay for child's therapy. Or some of those providers are also covered by the youth care. So after the adoption or guardianship, then we're first going to see if they have a provider that will be billed to the youth care. If not, we do have a pool of post-adoption contracts also that cover services for children who have been adopted or under guardianship. So if they don't have a provider that they're already working with, then the post-adoption worker would link and connect them to someone who would either be covered by the youth care or covered by the department via contract.
Eileen, how long do the subsidy payments, the monthly payments, exist for the child? Is it till age 18? Is there any time when it's up to
It is at
21?
least until age 18. And then they can be extended beyond that. So there are a couple programs I'm going to talk about. The first one being children who are still in school. So if they're turning 18 and they're still in high school, they can request a extension to either the graduation date or the 19th birthday, whichever comes first. So what happens is they're going to receive a letter from the post-adoption worker 6 months before that child turns 18 to say, is your child still in high school? And if so, send us the documentation, then we can extend it. The other extension is related to children who have special needs, whether it be like a medical special needs, mental health special needs, anything basically that's going to tell us that that child is not able to be fully independent at age 18. And if we get that documentation, then those are cases we are able to extend to the age of 21. In 2017, we changed our policy a little bit with children who are older youth in care. So for older youth in care, we have a Fostering Connections program that allows us to, if the child is age 16 at the time of the finalization of the adoption or guardianship, those children's subsidy is automatically going to go to age 21. There are things that we would require the parent to continue to notify us of, like if the child gets married, then the subsidy would terminate. If they join the military, the subsidy would terminate. Um, all of those are, I mean, there's a several qualifications that would put them ineligible, but ultimately, as long as that child remains with that parent is still financially and legally responsible for that child, those children will be extended to 21. It just goes automatically to 21 if they're 16 at the time of the finalization. That's why if you're working with a child who is like 15 and a half, we may not want to rush that case through in our 90 days. It would benefit them to wait to age 16 to do the finalization. So just something to kind of keep in mind.
If there's more than one child in the adoption or guardianship, are the fees the same, the monthly fees, or is it based on each child?
It's based on each child, and much like it is with the board payment, that those rates increase as the child ages.
Okay.
So until age 12. If they're over the age of 12, their rate is gonna be the same and it will stay at where it's at. Unless it's a special needs rate. So if the child's already receiving a special needs rate prior to the adoption or guardianship, they're going to continue that special needs rate, and that amount will never increase.
Okay.
And so right now our age 12 and up rate is maxed at $827 a month.
All right. For things like therapy, if they have the subsidy and they stop going to therapy, can they start back up?
Absolutely. And they don't need to go through us to necessarily do that. If they find a provider that's going to accept their youth care, then as the parent, you work that out, you get your child in the therapy. It's really only if they need some sort of provider that has a contract with us, do they have to kind of go through post-adoption to get that connection made.
Okay. Very good. Any information about a child with special needs for after 21 years old? Does that go to a disability type thing?
Yeah, and actually, even when they turn 18, those connections with like Social Security should already be made. But if you have a child who has like very extensive medical needs, I mean, they're likely already probably receiving Social Security at the time of the adoption or guardianship while they're still a youth in care. And if that's the case, after the adoption or guardianship gets finalized, they're going to get a letter from us that says, hey, this child was receiving Social Security. You need to go down to Social Security office and apply to be the beneficiary for that child's benefits.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm. Carrie, anything you want to jump in? I know I'm talking. Yes, the daycare is always like a sticking point for people because that's not covered over age 3. Camp, anything for school like tutoring, anything like that is really not able to be covered in the subsidy itself. If the child has some sort of school needs like speech therapy, occupational therapy, or something like that, that really is the responsibility of the school district to pay for through the IEP.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Questions about that? Carrie, you want to jump in? What am I missing here? I know I'm talking fast.
I think you covered most of it. Like Eileen said, again, the biggest thing is that daycare is going to cut off if the child is already over the age of 3. And then again, about that school piece, if they're needing services, it really should be provided through the IEP. It's not something that we write into the subsidy typically as far as the developmental, whether it be speech therapy, occupational, physical, that would be something you'd work with the school on.
And the subsidy, does it cover any of the actual, like just regular non-IEP fees or things that are needed?
No, it doesn't.
Mm-mm. Really, as the parent or guardian, they are, like responsible, just like any other parent or guardian would be for those kinds of costs. Extracurricular activities, all of that.
How much is the financial need of the family used to calculate those subsidies?
It's not at all. It's not a factor. Now, if the child is getting, say, a special needs rate prior to the adoption or guardianship, and the child was also getting some sort of Social Security, when they go to apply at that Social Security office, that's when the income of that family would become a factor, could become a factor. So they may not get both. Um, Other things, adoption preservation services. I don't know if Sarah is on here. She could jump in here. Otherwise, I'll just kind of share. So we do have specific adoption preservation programming. And we have a program like on this side of the region, like Rockford, Freeport, DeKalb area. Bright Point has the contract for post-adoption services. So the families can reach out to that program and get post-adoption services. They will come into the home and work with the family and the child. The post-adoption worker could do that referral. Otherwise, the family could do their own referral. Metropolitan Family Services is the other provider that we have on the other side of the region. So that would cover Lake, McHenry, Kane, DuPage, and the rest of the counties over that way. So those are specific programs that are in place. They don't need a referral from us, but we can do the referral if the family is more comfortable with that. Our post-adoption workers carry very high caseloads, but like I said, they are not going out to those homes. They are just available ultimately via phone for, referrals and connections to community providers. They're carrying about 1,800 cases apiece, roughly.
And that worker keeps the case until the child's subsidies no longer are being paid at 18 or 21.
Correct, yes.
And that is always a DCFS person?
Yes. So we have 3 in this region. So Sarah Meyer, she covers the 1A side of our region. Our region's kind of split into like 1A, 2A. So 1A is like Rockford, like so Winnebago, Boone County, DeKalb, Joe Davies, Stevenson, Carroll Lee, Whiteside, Ogle. So Sarah Meyer covers all of the families that reside in those counties. And then we have Kayla Zidrick, who sits in our Elgin office, and she covers all of Lake, McHenry, Kane, DuPage. And then Michelle Southern sits in our Joliet office, and she covers Will, Grundy, Kendall, and Kankakee. And she also covers like families who live out of state. So if a family adopts a youth in care here, although they're already residing out of state, Michelle carries those post-adoption cases as well. I saw a question pop up, but I didn't.
Yep. So are all of the things that you've talked about the same for both adoption and guardianship subsidies, or are there differences?
They are the same. Coverage wise, they are the same ultimately. Are interstate adoptions in scope or out of scope? I guess I don't understand that question, Dan. Could you be a little more specific?
I think we're wondering if the ICPC contracts, the subsidies that are done for those, are those something that are handled here in Illinois, or does that subsidy end up being part of the other state?
Yeah,
If the
that's the key
child is a
point.
youth in care of Illinois, then yes, that falls to us. So we would manage that subsidy here regardless of the child has lived in North Carolina for the past 5 years. If that was a youth in care in Illinois, one, we need the agreement of North Carolina to that they're approving this child in that adoptive home. That's part of the ICPC agreement. But that subsidy is still written here and maintained here after completion.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
What kind of supports are available to parents after they have had the adoption finalized, especially since trauma can show up at a later point?
So at any point after the adoption or guardianship is finalized, they have their post-adoption worker to reach out to for assistance. And most of our post-adoption workers will tell you that they're on the phone almost all day long, whether it be connecting families to community resources, just providing some support in whatever way needs to happen. If something develops like rather significantly, the family can request what we call a PAG staffing. That's like a post-adoption guardianship support system where we would convene a clinical staffing. The parent would participate. They would say, my child was diagnosed with this, or my child was determined to need this. And then we can talk about either adding those services into the subsidy specifically so we can pay directly for those, or we sometimes even increase the amount that they are receiving in terms of a subsidy to allow them to be able to absorb those additional costs that were not expected. Like I said too before, the adoption preservation programs are available to everyone. They do some parent groups. They do some limited respite programming. Not like your traditional respite that you might see for a child who's like a youth in care where they're going to go stay somewhere for a weekend with someone, but they do like some day respite. Meaning like the child may have a respite worker assigned who spends like a couple hours a week with them, taking them out of the home and doing some, therapeutic or extracurricular activities. Those are all built directly into the adoption preservation programming. If we have children, I would say probably all of our post-adoption workers, Carrie or I could tell you this too, that a lot of times we get calls from parents who have children with very significant mental health needs. When they hit teenage years and maybe things are spinning out of control and maybe they're determined to need some sort of more restrictive setting. Or that's at least what's being recommended from providers, then we kind of help them to navigate those systems too. There is, the FSP grant, which is through Department of Mental Health that if the child qualifies through like their SAS provider and the local mental health agency, they might be able to get a voucher there to pay for like a short-term residential programming through that FSP process. Then also there is now, and this is a relatively new concept for Illinois within the last year, the Beacon portal. And that is a portal like within the state of Illinois, which pulls all those resources kind of together, like Department of Mental Health, DCFS if need be, so that everyone is kind of working together to determine what the best course of action and treatment is for that child and how to help the family to navigate, whether it be a DCFS post-adoption or guardianship family or just a regular community family. This is not specific to DCFS at all. It's just general portal that helps all of those families with children with extensive mental health needs, because that is like such a population that we have seen an increase in the last several years.
How does that differ from the spider um, portal?
I'm not familiar with the spider portal, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
It is just like Beacon dot, Carrie, do you know offhand, or Heather, I could send it to you, Sharie, or Carrie and I could send it to you after this meeting. It's just like, it's a website basically. The parent can go in and just enter their child's information right into that portal. And then that kind of starts pulling people together.
Okay.
It also offers like resources for the family directly in the portal as well. I can tell you that, like I said, our timeline for writing the subsidy and getting everything completed is 90 days. I can tell you honestly that we struggle with some agencies more than others in terms of they send those subsidy packets to our reviewer. Our reviewer says, I'm missing this, this, and this. And, some agencies are really, thank you, Sharie. There it is. Um, some agencies are really good about getting those corrections to us or getting those additional materials that we need to be able to push that subsidy forward sooner than later. But some agencies are not as quickly able to get that stuff to us. I'm sure, if we have anyone on here from, Kane or even DuPage, there's times when, we've gotten court orders for one of our staff to appear at court and kind of speak to where the case is at because it's kind of stalled for whatever reason. If one of the agencies is dealing with an adoption, does DCFS have a say in choosing the new home? We do not. All the private agencies are full case management, so they fully manage those cases, and the department does not dictate where those children go or don't go. I can tell you that, we've gotten cases here where the goal is adoption. The agency sends it over saying, yes, I'm recommending this adoption of this child in this home. And it gets to my desk or Carrie's desk and we read it and we have some significant concerns. It doesn't happen frequently, but it's happened certainly probably about a dozen times in the last 10 years that I've been signing off on subsidies, whether it be like significant issues in the parent's background. Um, Maybe you've had a report on that parent within the last several years, or there's significant domestic violence in the home, recent. And there are some that I'm going to say I'm not comfortable signing off on this until we know that that adoptive parent has engaged in the services that we would request any parent to be able to, to engage in to say that that's a safe, permanent resource for the child. Any questions about that?
Again, we're asking what the private agencies are. Is Easter Seals one of your agencies?
It is. Yes. I see a question, a YSB.
So the parents, the adoptive parents, do they need to become licensed in order to be the adoptive parent?
They do not.
They do not.
They need to be, if it's a relative home, they cannot do guardianship unless they are licensed or the child is at least 12 years old. And that's a federal standard. What if they want to? How do they do this? How do they do this, meaning become licensed? Kara? Oh, so if they want to be licensed, so when you have a child that gets placed like from our investigative department. They take the child, they take protective custody, they place the child with a relative. Whether that case stays with the department or it goes to a private agency, the licensing department for either is going to be reaching out to that family from the get-go to start that ball rolling for licensing. They are not required to be licensed. So if they decline up front, then probably that's not going to ever be approached with them again unless they decide at some point down the road that they do want to be licensed, then the worker would navigate them back to the licensing unit. Yeah, sure. Heather, Carrie, anything I'm missing that you want to jump in on?
I don't think so. I think you covered everything with the subsidy piece.
You're doing a great job.
Oh, good. Thanks. Any other questions?
So if I can talk about barriers to the subsidies, one of the things you mentioned was the background checks. How do you find, I'm interested in what some of the other barriers are, but we're also wondering about families that are not English speakers. What are those barriers and how are those handled? Does that delay the subsidy, et cetera?
It can delay. Unfortunately, in our region at this time, we do not have a bilingual subsidy worker. So if we get a family referred for, subsidy processing and the family is predominantly Spanish, we have a couple workers that we tap into in our Chicago office from our Chicago adoption unit. They would be the ones who would need to write that subsidy because, and yes, it gets more complicated because ultimately they're doing double the work because they're doing the subsidies in English, but they're also doing the subsidies in Spanish.
Any other barriers that you run into typically?
The background I would say is the biggest one. Agencies who sometimes we get cases, like I said, and it's probably only happened a dozen times in the last 10 years for me, but when there's significant safety issues in that home that have not been addressed, that's a big sticking point for me. So if you've had ongoing, reports in the home, or you've seen ongoing domestic violence arrests in the home, and the agency hasn't done due diligence in terms of making sure that the family is addressing those issues, that is a big barrier. There is an adoption assessment when cases are referred to our unit for writing of subsidies. There's an initial assessment that's done, but then it's going to be up to, Heather and Joseph or Shaquila to write a much more thorough assessment, which is going to entail gathering a lot more information. And really, delving deep into criminal history if there is one. We always need to ask those questions. I don't care if it's 20 years ago. If you had a slew of arrests 20 years ago, what did you do to resolve those? We always want those questions answered to make sure that that's not going to impact this child in that home.
Can you talk a little bit more about becoming a licensed person? Are there advantages to it? I understand the guardianship has to get licensed, but the adoption doesn't. Why
Yeah.
would we encourage them to be licensed if they're going to get the licensed fee anyway?
Well, the biggest advantage to them is going to be the board rate. The board rate is going to be significantly more for you as a licensed home. You are also going to get that training opportunity. if you're an unlicensed home, your worker's going to be out visiting at least twice a month with you. So you have a decrease in terms of worker contact if you're licensed. Um, and like I said, they don't have to be licensed to do guardianship, but they do if the child is under the age of 12. Level of care specialized. Are level of care specialized children automatically given special needs treatment? I mean, ultimately, they should be. It depends upon what level of care and why that child is considered specialized. So we have several agencies that deal with specialized children. So if we have a case here that is being managed by DCFS, we don't have those specialized resources. Then they go to like what's considered a SIP meeting, and I'm sure some of you have probably participated in SIP meetings where you're determining whether or not that child is going to be specialized. If they make that determination, the child's specialized, um, then they would send that the department would send that case out to a private agency. They would kind of get matched and see what agency would take that case on. And then, of course, the advantage there is that you're going to have those specialized caseworkers who are going to be frequently in your home, linking you to other services, as well as you are going to be eligible to have like that on-call system. Like the department doesn't have the ability to have on-call for children who are, having issues in a home, after hours. Whereas those specialized contracts do provide that. Yeah, sure. Any other questions for us?
Are there any differences between a grandparent or a relative adopting the child versus a licensed home ultimately?
In terms of what's provided after adoption or guardianship, you mean?
Yes.
No. The only major difference would be if that home wasn't licensed, they're actually going to get that higher rate after the finalization. So if grandma's not licensed, she's only getting $4.58 a month for that board payment. The child is whatever age, she's going to get like, the 768 or the 827, whatever, depending upon the age of the child.
Okay.
Oh, another delay involves 60 plus checklists. Yes, I can explain that. And Carrie and I are the ones who do the 60 plus staffings. So, if the caregiver, one or both of them are over the age of 60, there's some additional paperwork that is required. That actually came out of a lawsuit against the department through the Inspector General's office, which is why this procedure was put in place. But the worker is required to do the 60 plus checklist, which basically is like a 5-page document kind of explaining, the child, whether that child has special needs, the parent or parents. It requires a physical on that parent or parents if they are over the age of 60, so that we make sure that there's no significant medical issues that could impact the permanency of that child long term. We get that information here, and Carrie and I will read through that and see if there is major concerns. If there are not major concerns, those staffings are going to be done via WebEx, and they take less than 10 minutes, probably, at most. We're just kind of going through that information, asking questions about the child. The backup caregiver who the parent has identified is required to be a part of that staffing, just so we make sure, because it's an older caregiver, that there is an adequate backup plan in place for the child should something happen to that caregiver after the adoption or guardianship. There are less than a handful of ones that I've actually gone in person to do since I've been here 10 years. And that was only because we might have had a child with, significant special needs, medical, wheelchair bound, and a much older caregiver, who realistically was maybe not going to be able to provide for that child till that child turns 18. So there have been only a handful that I have actually gone in person to kind of do a more clear assessment before signing off on that. We do those like all week long. Like I could tell you, I had already 2 this morning. I probably roughly do maybe 6 per week, because we do have a lot of older caregivers. But they're very fast. As long as we get all the paperwork that we need, we're able to set those up within a day or 2. And it's a matter of, 5 to 10 minute kind of WebEx with the family, and then it's done. So that definitely should not be a barrier to any adoption moving forward.
You said you can do it as long as you've got all the paperwork. Is it the typical subsidy paperwork that you're needing in order to have that conversation? Or is there something?
No, just the 60 plus checklist, which is, a form that we have. It's a 5-page form.
Okay.
And then the medical. So the medical for the caregiver. So those are the 2 pieces of documentation we need to get that scheduled. We should be scheduling those before the subsidy packet ever comes to our unit.
Okay.
The only barriers I've seen is like getting sometimes a medical for a caregiver, and it's like 2 years old. Well, we require them to be within the last year at least. But that's very rare. I rarely see those coming to me and we don't have everything that we need. And most of the agencies, adoption writers, are very familiar with the process and what's needed. Okay, your case has been waiting for months for the 60 plus. Okay, was it Julie? That question?
Julie Calzow.
Julie, reach out to me when we're done here so I can do a little follow-up for you.
I will.
doesn't take
How do I
months.
get a hold of you? Can you send me a message?
I will, sure
Okay.
will. Yep,
Thank
I'll
you.
put my email in the chat. Or actually, Heather, would you mind putting Carrie and my email in the chat? Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
there is never a time when things go months, 60 plus go months without being scheduled. So if you're being told that, there's obviously another issue going on here. Thank you, Heather.
And so you said the adoption worker is the person who provides the 60 plus checklist and the need for the physical. Is that who you said is primarily responsible?
Most of the time, yes. Depending upon the agency, sometimes they have the actual caseworker to do all that documentation. Just kind of depends on the agency.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, recently, I think last week I had a worker reach out to me or just to send me the checklist and say, hey, I need this signed off on. And I was like, no, the process is this. We have to do a staffing. Like I explain it. But most of the time, Carrie and I are dealing with the same people for every agency.
Okay.
Recent issue with a non-US citizen relative. I missed the end of your question, Laura, so I'll go to the chat.
So
okay,
we have an adoption that is citizen, so undocumented, in the middle of adoption in Cook County, but Cook County has now stated that this is a problem. How do we address this?
It shouldn't be a problem, and I can tell you that myself and all the staff have been trained on kind of how to manage some of those issues. But they don't have to be a U.S. citizen to adopt or do guardianship. They have to have, if they're not a citizen, they don't have a social security number, they have to be assigned a different number so that we can track and actually run the backgrounds appropriately. But it is definitely not something that should be a barrier unless for some reason, something happened and that parent becomes, gets deported for some reason. So I'm not sure, Laura. I guess the question is who in Cook County is telling you this is a problem? And maybe shoot me an email. And I can try and do a little further looking right now. I'm actually covering all of Cook County at this time as well. So I can help you to try to navigate some answers there.
Thank you.
Sure.
There's a question in there about an incarcerated parent. I think you might have missed.
Oh, yeah. Can you read it to me?
If the bio parent is incarcerated and relative adopts, can there be requirements of the adoption that the child not be living in the same household when the parent is released from jail?
Well, we can't really necessarily track that after the fact. So no, there's not really a standard way that is handled. But I can tell you if we become aware that there's a parent living in that home, then we're not going to be able to move forward on that adoption. We wouldn't approve an adoption with the biological parent living in the home. After the fact, people make all kinds of decisions. So that's not something that we track or would be aware of. If that did come to the attention of the post-adoption worker, they would, definitely reach out and try and get more information and figure out what's going on there.
Would you approve a guardianship with the natural parent living in the home?
No.
Is that a law or a rule that you wouldn't approve guardianship? Or is that just conventional wisdom and best practice?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily in procedures, I wouldn't say, but we wouldn't consider it a foster placement if there was a parent in that home.
Okay.
We've had, and this goes back to my days in permanency, but I've had a couple of times where, judges might say, well, grandma's gonna be the foster parent, but we're gonna put an order to allow that mom to move in this home. Then no, then they're not gonna get a board payment from us because we're not gonna pay that parent and that relative if they're all in the same household. So we've had to have DCFS legal to intervene on some of those. I mean, that's been years ago now, but that has happened in the past. But no, ultimately, it's not considered a foster placement if you have a parent living in that house.
Thank you. That was my intuition as well, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions for us? No? Okay. Well, if you think of some after the fact, Sharie, you know where to find us, and everyone should now that our emails are here in the chat, thanks to Heather. So if you have specific case questions, reach out to us. We will do our best to help you find the answers that you're looking for. And I would like to thank everyone for coming today. And we are exactly just over an hour, so perfect.
Thank you so very much. I think that this is so much the information that many of us were seeking. So I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. We're happy to help. So thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your day.